I didn't realize how deep the wound was until my own daughter told me I didn't belong on her vacation. Not because of money, not because of space, but because my presence no longer fit the life she wanted to show the world. In that moment, I understood something far more painful than rejection. I had become a secret, someone to be edited out, explained away, quietly erased. What followed wasn't anger or revenge, but a reckoning, one that forced us both to confront who we had become and what silence had slowly destroyed. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Holloway, though most people have always called me Maggie. I am 64 years old, a widow, and I live alone in a small, quiet neighborhood on the east side of Portland, Oregon. My house is modest, the kind that blends into the background, much like I have learned to do over the years. I wake up early, even though I no longer have to, and I still measure my days by routine. Old habits do not disappear just because life slows down. For most of my adult life, I worked with my hands. I cleaned apartment stairwells before sunrise, fixed broken locks for property managers who barely remembered my name, and spent long shifts hauling supplies through hospital corridors that never slept. These were not jobs that came with titles or recognition, but they paid the bills and, more importantly, they kept my daughter clothed, fed, and in school. I never expected gratitude. I only expected that the work would mean something in the end. My husband died when our daughter, Evelyn, was still young. The details are not important anymore. What matters is that from that moment on, everything became my responsibility. I learned how to be practical, how to push fear aside, how to keep moving, even when exhaustion settled into my bones. I told myself that if I could give Evelyn choices, then every sore muscle and missed night of sleep would be worth it. Evelyn was bright and determined, eager to leave Portland and the life she saw me living. I encouraged that. I wanted her to want more. When she moved to San Francisco, California, I felt a mix of pride and relief. She had stepped into a world that looked nothing like mine, and I believed that was exactly the point. Success, I thought, was supposed to create distance from hardship. At first, we talked often. She told me about her job, her new apartment, the people she met. I listened carefully, memorizing details so I could ask the right questions later. Over time, the conversations grew shorter. Calls were postponed. Messages became polite updates instead of real exchanges. I noticed that she stopped asking about my days, and I stopped offering details she did not seem interested in hearing. It was not one dramatic moment that made me feel left behind. It was a collection of small absences, invitations that never came, decisions that were already made before I heard about them, stories that started with we, but no longer included me. I remained her mother in title, but my presence in her life began to feel optional. I told myself this was normal. Children grow up. They build their own lives. Mothers learn to step back. Still, there were moments when the silence lingered too long, when I sensed that I no longer fit comfortably into the world my daughter was building. I did not feel angry. I felt unseen. I had not failed. I had done what I set out to do. Evelyn had opportunities I never did, and she had taken them. Yet somewhere along the way, the distance between us became more than geography. It became a quiet understanding that I belonged to a past she was trying not to carry with her. I remained where I was, steady and self-contained, believing that love did not need constant proof. I told myself that being a good mother sometimes meant standing in the background, even when the background felt farther away than I had ever imagined. If you're still watching and this opening feels uncomfortably familiar, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Because what came next wasn't just distance, it was a single message that quietly erased me from my daughter's plans. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The evening was unremarkable in every way. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window, the familiar Oregon drizzle that never fully commits to a storm. I had just finished washing a single plate and a single cup, the quiet efficiency of living alone. My phone rested on the counter, face down, exactly where I always left it. There was no sense of urgency in the room, no hint that anything was about to shift. When the notification came through, I almost ignored it. Evelyn rarely contacted me late in the evening, and when she did, it was usually a short update or a forwarded photo meant to fill a gap. I dried my hands, turned the phone over, and saw her name. The message was not long. It was carefully written, polite, and distant, the way professional emails tend to be. She explained that there would be a family vacation soon at Redwood Cove Resort in Big Sur, California. She mentioned that Lucas's family would be there, along with a few people connected to his work. She added that the schedule would be full and the arrangements complicated. Then came the sentence that settled heavily in my chest. It would be better, she said, if I did not join them this time. I read the message once, then again scanning for something I might have missed. There was no confusion in the wording. This was not a misunderstanding or an oversight. It was a decision that had already been made, neatly wrapped in considerate language. I sat down at the kitchen table and let the quiet stretch around me. My first instinct was not anger. It was a familiar urge to protect my daughter from discomfort, even when I was the one feeling it. I typed a short reply, careful not to sound wounded or demanding. I told her to enjoy the trip and to have a wonderful time. I pressed send before I could reconsider. The message disappeared, and with it went any opportunity for immediate explanation. After that, the room felt different. Not louder or darker, just emptier. I thought about how easily I had been removed from the plan, how naturally my absence seemed to fit into her version of events. This was not about space or logistics. It was about belonging. Somewhere along the way, my presence had become optional. I did not hear back from her that night. There was no follow-up, no reassurance. I replayed the message in my mind, aligning it with the months of brief phone calls and postponed visits. The pattern was suddenly clear. This message was not an isolated moment. It was a confirmation. What Evelyn did not know, what no one in her world knew, was that Redwood Cove Resort was not just a destination I'd heard of in passing. It was a place I knew intimately, down to the slope of the land and the rhythm of the tide below the cliffs. Years earlier, when no one was paying attention, I had been the one who believed in its potential. I had put my name nowhere visible and my presence nowhere obvious, choosing discretion over recognition. I had built something quietly, patiently, never imagining it would one day become the setting for my own exclusion. As I sat there, I realized that the pain did not come from missing a vacation. It came from understanding that my daughter did not see me as part of that world, not even as a background figure. She had not argued with me or rejected me outright. She had simply arranged her life in a way that no longer included me. I did not make any decisions that night. I did not plan or confront or explain. I acknowledged the truth for what it was. Evelyn had chosen a version of her life where I did not fit, and she had done so calmly, without hesitation. That realization stayed with me long after the rain stopped, marking the moment when I understood that something far deeper than a vacation had been taken away. If you're still watching and that message made your chest tighten, comment number 2 to let me know you felt it too. Because I soon discovered that this wasn't a misunderstanding at all. It was a lie that went much deeper. Now let's move on to chapter 3. The days after Evelyn's message passed quietly, but the quiet felt heavier than before. I went about my routines, folded laundry, watered the plants by the window, and answered emails that did not matter. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, something had shifted, though I could not yet name it. I found myself paying closer attention, listening for what was not said rather than what was. It started with something small. A former neighbor forwarded me a link to a professional networking site congratulating Evelyn on a recent project. I read it out of idle curiosity, expecting nothing. In the brief paragraph where she thanked her supporters, she mentioned Lucas's parents by name and referred warmly to family encouragement. My name was not there. That omission alone meant little, but it echoed the absence I had been feeling for months. I scrolled through comments and photos, noticing how carefully her public life had been curated. There was no space in it for me. A few days later, the truth arrived by accident, delivered without drama. A woman I barely knew, connected loosely through Lucas's extended family, sent me a polite note meant for someone else. She apologized for the confusion and added a line explaining she had assumed I would not attend any gatherings because, as she had been told, I was living in an assisted care facility and my health was fragile. I stared at the words, reading them over until they lost shape. I was not in any facility. I lived alone. I drove myself. I cooked my own meals. I walked my neighborhood every morning. There was nothing fragile about my health, except perhaps my heart at that moment. The realization did not hit me like a blow. It settled slowly, the way cold seeps into your bones before you notice you are shivering. Evelyn had not simply excluded me from a vacation. She had rewritten my circumstances to make my absence easier to explain. In her world, I was no longer an independent woman who might ask questions or take up space. I had become a convenient story, one that required no further thought. I tried to understand it from her perspective. I imagined the room she moved through now, filled with people who spoke confidently about investments, appearances, and influence. I pictured myself entering those spaces, my past clinging to me like a scent she could not wash away. Perhaps she believed she was protecting herself. Perhaps she thought this small lie was harmless. Still, I could not ignore what it cost. Being poor had never embarrassed me. Being erased did. I had spent my life teaching my daughter to stand tall, to claim her place, to never apologize for honest work. Somewhere along the way, she had learned a different lesson. She had learned that distance could be a form of safety. I did not call her. I did not confront her or ask for an explanation. I sat with the knowledge instead, letting it clarify what had been vague before. This was not a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. It was a choice she had made repeatedly, carefully, and without me. I thought about the years I had pushed myself beyond exhaustion so she would never feel limited. I wondered when those efforts had turned into something she felt the need to hide. The question that haunted me was not why she had done it, but how easily she had done it. By the end of that week, I understood something I had been reluctant to admit. If I continued to remain silent, nothing would change. My absence would harden into fact, my role reduced to a footnote or a fabrication. I was still her mother, but in the life she was building, I had been quietly removed. That realization marked the first true fracture, the moment when sadness gave way to the understanding that what I was facing was not distance, but betrayal. If you're still watching and the truth you just heard shocked you, comment number 3, so I know you're still here. What I did next wasn't confrontation or anger. It was silence, and a decision that changed everything. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. I stood in my kitchen one morning with my phone in my hand, staring at Evelyn's name on the screen. It would have been easy to call her, easier still to ask why she had lied, why she had pushed me out so cleanly. The words formed themselves in my mind, sharp and ready. Instead, I set the phone down. I knew myself well enough to understand that any conversation we had in that moment would end in careful apologies and partial truths. I was not ready for either. Something in me had shifted. The hurt was still there, but it had settled into a quieter, more deliberate place. I was no longer reacting. I was thinking. If I wanted to understand what had happened to my daughter, I needed to see her as she was now, not as the child I remembered or the version she offered me in brief phone calls. That was when I decided to go to Big Sur, California. I made the arrangements quickly and quietly, booking my stay at Redwood Cove Resort under my maiden name. I did not tell Evelyn. I did not tell anyone connected to her or to Lucas. The anonymity was important. I did not want special treatment or recognition. I wanted to see what unfolded when I was not part of the picture at all. The drive down the coast was long, the scenery unfolding in wide stretches of ocean and cliffs that dropped sharply into the water below. Big Sur had a way of stripping things down, reminding you how small individual conflicts were against something that had existed long before you arrived. When I reached the resort, I felt a familiar mix of pride and distance. This place carried years of quiet work and careful choices, yet I entered it as a stranger. I checked in without incident. No one looked twice at me. I took the key, thanked the attendant, and walked toward my room. As I moved through the property, I noticed details most guests missed: the way staff spoke to one another, the rhythm of the day, the balance between luxury and restraint. These were things I had cared about deeply when I helped shape the place. Seeing them intact brought a measure of calm. That evening, I sat on the balcony and listened to the sound of the waves below. I thought about why I had chosen not to confront Evelyn immediately. It was not weakness. It was patience. I had learned long ago that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are unobserved. If my daughter had truly become someone who needed to hide me, I needed to understand that before I decided what came next. Over the following days, I settled into a routine. I walked the grounds early in the morning, watched guests arrive and leave, and paid attention to how people interacted with those they considered invisible. I remembered why I had believed in this place to begin with. I had wanted to create something rooted in respect, where work was valued and dignity was not dependent on status. Standing there alone, I felt the contradiction of my position more sharply than ever. I was surrounded by something I had helped build, yet I was preparing to watch my own daughter move through it without knowing I was there. The thought was unsettling, but it also felt necessary. This was not about catching her in a mistake. It was about seeing the truth without interference. By the time I learned the exact dates of Evelyn's arrival, my resolve had hardened into something steady. I was no longer asking myself whether I should be there. I knew I needed to be. I would observe, I would listen, and when the time came, I would decide what kind of relationship, if any, could still be salvaged. For now, I waited. If you're still watching and wondering why I chose to stay quiet instead of speaking up, comment number 4 below, because what I witnessed next, without saying a single word, broke something I didn't know could break. Now let's move on to chapter 5. The cocktail reception was held just after sunset, when the light along the cliffs softened and the ocean below turned a deep shade of blue. Guests gathered in small circles, glasses in hand, voices low and controlled, the kind of atmosphere designed to make everyone feel important. I stood near the edge of the terrace, indistinguishable from any other quiet guest, watching rather than participating. When Evelyn arrived, I recognized her immediately, not because she was my daughter, but because she moved with an ease that said she belonged there. She looked comfortable, polished, at home among people who spoke confidently about travel, business, and influence. Lucas walked beside her, relaxed and assured, followed closely by his parents. They were greeted warmly, the kind of greeting reserved for those who mattered. I told myself to remain detached. This was what I had come for, to observe without interrupting, to see the reality without the filter of motherhood. Still, something tightened in my chest as I watched Evelyn smile and lean into conversations, her laughter light and unguarded. The remarks began subtly. Lucas's mother commented on how exhausting it must be to work in service roles, how some people never seem to rise beyond them. The words were wrapped in politeness, delivered with a sympathetic tone that made them sound reasonable. People nodded. Someone laughed softly. I felt my hands curl around the edge of my glass. Then Lucas added his own contribution, sharing a story about how different backgrounds shape expectations. He spoke casually, as if recounting a harmless anecdote, mentioning how his wife had grown up around very simple work. He did not say my name. He did not have to. The implication was clear enough. I waited for Evelyn to step in. I waited for her to redirect the conversation, or even to fall silent. Instead, she laughed. It was not nervous or strained. It was easy, natural, a sound that blended seamlessly with the others. In that moment, something inside me gave way. It was not the words themselves that hurt the most. I had heard worse in my life. It was the realization that my daughter had chosen alignment over truth. She had chosen to belong, even if that belonging required turning my life into a joke. Her laughter was not forced. It was agreement. I stood there, unseen, in a place shaped by my own quiet labor, listening as the story moved on and the conversation shifted. No one noticed my stillness. No one noticed the way I stepped back, creating a little more distance between myself and the sound of their voices. The irony was sharp. I owned the ground beneath our feet, yet I had never felt smaller. As the evening continued, I paid attention to how easily the moment passed for them. The laughter faded, replaced by new topics and fresh drinks. For Evelyn, it was over as soon as it had begun. For me, it lingered, heavy and unmistakable. I realized then that I could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding. This was not discomfort or fear on her part. This was a choice she had made, consciously or not, to stand with those who diminished me. The distance between us was no longer just emotional, it was moral. I left the reception early, slipping away without drawing attention. The path back to my room was quiet, lit only by low lanterns and the steady rhythm of the waves below. With every step, my resolve sharpened. Observation alone was no longer enough. I did not yet know what I would do, but I knew what I could not continue doing. I had come to understand who my daughter was in this world. The question that remained was what I would do with that knowledge. I returned to my room after the reception and closed the door quietly behind me. The sound of the ocean was still there, steady and indifferent, as if nothing of consequence had happened. I sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the lights and let the darkness settle. I did not cry. I'd already passed the point where tears felt useful. What remained was a clear, almost unsettling calm. Evelyn's laughter replayed in my mind, not loudly, but persistently. It was not the cruelty of it that stayed with me, but the ease. She had laughed the way people do when they feel safe, when they believe they are surrounded by those who understand them. That realization cut deeper than any insult. It told me that this version of my daughter did not feel conflicted about where she stood. I considered what it would mean to reveal myself immediately. I could have done it that very night. A phone call to management, A quiet word to the right person, and the truth would have surfaced. The whispers would have stopped. The laughter would have turned into apologies. I imagined their faces, the sudden shift in posture, the careful attempts to explain. I knew how that scene would play out. But I also knew what it would not do. It would not make Evelyn understand why what she had done mattered. It would not force her to examine her choices. It would only teach her to be more cautious, more strategic in how she distanced herself. Fear is not the same as respect, and embarrassment is not the same as remorse. For a long time, I had confused silence with patience. That night, I understood the difference. Patience waits for change. Silence can demand it. I was tired of reacting to decisions that had already been made without me. If there was any chance of salvaging our relationship, it would not come from catching her off guard or asserting my power. It would come from clarity. The conflict inside me was familiar. I had lived my entire adult life balancing responsibility with self-erasure. Being a mother had taught me to absorb discomfort so my child would not have to. Being a woman who had worked her way through life had taught me endurance. But endurance has limits, and I had reached mine. I asked myself what I wanted most. It was not an apology spoken under pressure. It was not acknowledgement tied to my assets. I wanted to know whether my daughter could recognize the harm she had done without being forced to. I wanted to know whether she was capable of choosing differently when the outcome was uncertain. That meant waiting. It meant allowing the situation to develop further, even if that carried the risk of more pain. I understood that this choice might not lead to reconciliation. It might confirm that the distance between us was permanent. Accepting that possibility was the hardest part of all. I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the darkened coastline. This place represented years of restraint and foresight, decisions made without immediate reward. I had built it by trusting long horizons. Now I applied the same principle to my own life. I would not rush toward a moment of satisfaction that offered no real resolution. By choosing not to reveal myself, I reclaimed something I had lost without noticing: control. Not over Evelyn, but over my own response. I would set the terms under which the truth emerged, or I would accept whatever outcome followed from my restraint. That night, I began to plan. Not in detail, not yet, but in intention. I would create a moment where Evelyn could no longer remain neutral, where she would have to choose between convenience and integrity. Whether she chose me or not was no longer entirely in my hands. What was in my hands was the manner in which I faced whatever came next. When I finally lay down, sleep came slowly, but beneath the lingering hurt, there was a steadiness I had not felt in years. I had decided who I would be in this story, and for the first time, that decision did not depend on anyone else. If you're still watching and curious about what happens when the truth can no longer stay hidden, comment number 6 to show you're still with me. Because in the next chapter, silence ends and consequences begin. Now let's move on to chapter 7. The meeting was scheduled for late morning, tucked between routine operational updates and a review of long-term planning. On the agenda, it looked ordinary. In the room, the atmosphere was professional and neutral, the kind of setting where people expect predictability. I arrived without ceremony and took a seat at the table, aware that this time I was not a guest or an observer. I was there openly, with my name attached to the decisions that followed. When the introductions began, my role was stated plainly: founder. The word carried its own weight. It landed softly at first, then settled, changing the air in the room. I did not look around immediately. I waited for the shift to register, for the quiet recalibration that happens when assumptions collapse. I did not need to search for Evelyn. I felt her recognition before I saw it. The realization moved through her posture, the way she straightened and then froze, as if the ground beneath her had altered without warning. There was no drama in the moment, No raised voices or sudden exits. There was only the unmistakable knowledge that something essential had been revealed. As the discussion continued, I spoke when necessary, keeping my tone measured and factual. I avoided explanations and justifications. This was not the place for them. The purpose of the meeting was not to rewrite the past, but to acknowledge the present. Around the table, the balance of attention shifted. Those who had arrived confident now listened more carefully. Those who had dismissed me earlier, unknowingly, recalculated. I watched Evelyn from the corner of my eye. She said little. The confidence I had seen at the reception was gone, replaced by a focused stillness. I did not feel satisfaction. If anything, I felt the weight of inevitability. This was not a triumph. It was a consequence. At one point, I asked a single question, directing it toward her without raising my voice or changing my expression. If I had not been the owner of this place, would she have stood beside me when it mattered? I did not frame it as an accusation. I offered it as a consideration. The room went quiet, not because it demanded an answer, but because everyone understood its meaning. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable in the usual sense. It was clarifying. There was nowhere for explanations to hide, no narrative that could soften the implication. I did not wait for her response. Some questions do their work simply by existing. When the meeting concluded, people gathered their materials and filed out, careful and subdued. Conversations resumed in lower tones, as if volume itself had become inappropriate. I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the stillness settle. The truth had entered the room, and nothing would be arranged quite the same way again. As I left, I felt a mixture of relief and loss that surprised me with its intensity. Relief that I no longer had to pretend. Loss for the version of my daughter I had hoped still existed. I had not forced her hand or cornered her into a confession. I had simply removed the shelter she had built around her choices. Outside, the air was cool and clear. The ocean stretched out beyond the cliffs, indifferent to human reversals. I stood there briefly, grounding myself in the familiar rhythm of the place. What had happened could not be undone. The truth, once spoken, reshapes everything around it. I knew this moment did not resolve anything. It marked a beginning, not an end. Whatever came next would require honesty, not leverage. Whether Evelyn could meet me there was still uncertain. What was certain was that the distance between us could no longer be explained away. It had been named, and with that naming came the possibility, however fragile, of something different. After the meeting, the resort seemed unusually quiet. The usual movement of staff and guests continued, but to me it felt muted, as if the place itself were holding its breath. I knew the truth had shifted something fundamental, yet I was careful not to mistake exposure for resolution. Power had changed hands in the room, but that was never the outcome I wanted. Evelyn and I met later that afternoon in a small conference space overlooking the trees. It was neutral ground, chosen deliberately. No family members, no colleagues, no witnesses. Just 2 chairs, a table, and years of unspoken distance settling between us. For the first time in a long while, there was nowhere for either of us to hide. She spoke first. Her voice was steady but thin, as if each sentence required effort. She admitted that she had been afraid for a long time, afraid of being judged, of being dismissed, of losing her place among people who measured worth by appearance and connections. She said she had convinced herself that keeping me at a distance was a form of protection, not rejection. Hearing that did not soften the truth, but it explained its shape. I listened without interrupting. I had spent too many years absorbing discomfort to need to defend myself now. When it was my turn, I did not talk about ownership or influence. I talked about absence. about what it feels like to realize that the person you raised believes your life is something to be hidden. I told her that my work had never been a source of shame to me, but being erased had been. The room remained still as those words settled. I watched her expression change, not dramatically, but in a way that suggested something had finally reached her. For the first time, she was not trying to manage how the conversation sounded. She was listening to what it meant. I told her what I needed, and it was less than she seemed to expect. I did not ask for declarations or gestures. I asked for honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. I asked that she not remain silent when others diminished me. I asked that she stop rewriting my life to make her own easier to explain. These were not demands. They were boundaries. She did not promise anything that day. She did not need to. The value of the conversation was not in the assurances offered, but in the fact that it happened at all. We had finally named the distance between us without disguising it as politeness or practicality. When we stood to leave, there was no embrace, no dramatic reconciliation. There was a pause, and then a shared understanding that something had shifted, even if its final shape was not yet clear. The door was not closed. It was simply no longer being avoided. As I walked back toward my room, I felt neither victorious nor defeated. I felt tired, but lighter than I had in weeks. The future of our relationship remained uncertain, but it would not be built on silence anymore. That, for me, was enough to keep going, to see what might still be possible if both of us were willing to stay present in the truth we had finally allowed into the open. If you're still watching and wondering whether this story ends in loss or healing, comment number 8 below. The final chapter reveals what truly changed, what didn't, and why this ending might not be what you expect. Now, let's move on to the conclusion of the story. The days that followed our conversation unfolded without drama. There were no confrontations in hallways, no emotional scenes designed for closure. Instead, time moved forward in small, deliberate steps. I noticed the changes not because they were announced, but because they altered the rhythm of everything around us. Evelyn withdrew from the consulting role tied to the proposed development near Redwood Cove. She did not make a statement or ask for approval. She simply stepped away, choosing distance over compromise. I understood what that decision cost her. The Whitmore family had been invested in the deal, not just financially, but socially. Their support cooled almost immediately. Invitations stopped. Calls grew formal. The ease she once moved with among them was replaced by a careful restraint. Her marriage felt the strain as well, not in arguments or ultimatums, but in the quiet negotiations couples make when assumptions fall apart. Lucas did not oppose her choice outright, but he did not shield her from its consequences either. They were learning, slowly, that alignment built on convenience is fragile. Watching this unfold was painful, but it was also honest. Growth rarely arrives without friction. For my part, I continued my work at Redwood Cove with the same restraint I had always practiced. I did not celebrate or assert my position beyond what was necessary. I reaffirmed the values that had guided the place from the beginning, focusing on sustainability and respect for the people who kept it running. There was no sense of victory in that, only responsibility. Evelyn and I remained in contact, though cautiously. Our conversations were shorter than they once had been, but they were real. She did not avoid mentioning me when speaking about her life. I did not soften my past to make it more palatable. We were not rebuilding closeness yet. We were establishing truth. What mattered most was what no longer happened. I was not excluded by default. I was not rewritten into something easier to explain. When silence appeared between us, it was no longer a tool for erasure, but a pause we both acknowledged. That distinction changed everything. I learned to accept that this was not a story of redemption neatly tied with understanding. It was a recalibration. Some distances remained. Some trust would take time, if it returned at all, but the relationship was no longer built on pretense, and that alone felt like progress. As I reflected on the path that had brought us here, I realized how easy it is to mistake endurance for harmony. For years, I had absorbed discomfort in the name of love. Now, I understood that love without truth is a fragile thing. It bends until it breaks. This was not the ending I might have wished for, but it was one I could live with. We had stepped out of illusion and into something less comfortable but far more solid. Whatever came next would be shaped by that choice, and for the first time in a long while, I felt prepared to meet it without shrinking myself to fit. Time passed quietly after everything settled. There were no final confrontations, no speeches meant to summarize what had happened. Life returned to its steady rhythm, and I found myself alone more often, not in loneliness, but in reflection. In that quiet, I began to understand what the experience had truly taken from me and what it had given back. For a long time, I believed endurance was the highest form of love. I believed that if I absorbed enough discomfort, if I stayed small enough, the people I loved would eventually feel safe and grateful. What I learned instead was that endurance without honesty slowly erases the person doing the enduring. Love that requires disappearance is not love. It is negotiation. Money played a role in revealing the truth, but it was never the point. Wealth did not make my voice valid. It simply removed the excuse others used to ignore it. The hardest lesson was realizing that I had never needed proof of worth. I had already earned it through years of work, responsibility, and care. Recognition did not create that value. It only exposed how easily it could be dismissed. Being a mother does not mean surrendering dignity. I had confused sacrifice with silence, thinking the two were inseparable. They are not. Sacrifice can be generous. Silence, when used to protect injustice, corrosive. Setting boundaries did not make me less loving. It made me honest. As for my daughter, I no longer see her as someone who betrayed me out of cruelty. She is a woman shaped by fear, by pressure, by the belief that acceptance is conditional. That does not excuse her choices, but it explains them. She must learn, said I did, that belonging purchased at the cost of integrity is temporary. This story is not about winning or losing. It is about standing still long enough to see yourself clearly when everything else falls away. I am still a mother. I am still imperfect, but I no longer shrink to fit someone else's comfort. If there is a message here, it is a simple one. Your value does not depend on being invited, approved, or included. It exists before those things and after them. When you stop asking to be seen and start choosing to remain whole, the rest becomes secondary. I did not reclaim my place in my daughter's world. I reclaimed my place in my own. And that, I have learned, is where every real beginning starts. Some stories do not end with celebration or defeat. They end with clarity. At its heart, this journey was never about money, status, or being proven right. It was about what happens when truth replaces silence, and when dignity is reclaimed after years of quiet compromise. It reminds us that love without honesty slowly loses its shape, and that belonging built on denial is never stable. Growth often arrives disguised as loss, and integrity usually asks a higher price than comfort. Yet, in choosing wholeness over approval, something essential is restored. Not everything broken is meant to be fixed the same way it was built. Some things must be rebuilt differently, with firmer boundaries and clearer values. And sometimes, the most meaningful victory is not being chosen by others, but choosing yourself without apology. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring stories that speak to real life, real emotions, and real choices together.